The smell hit them first. Not gunfire, not explosions, a smell. The soldiers of the U.S. 4th Armored Division were driving down a quiet country road in Germany, April 4, 1945. The war was almost over. The trees were blooming. Spring was in the air. Then they hit a wall. Not a physical wall, but something worse, a stench so thick, so overwhelming that grown men started gagging in their jeeps. It smelled like death, like rotting flesh, like something burning that should never burn. General George S. Patton was in his command car when the smell reached him. Old blood and guts himself, the man who loved war more than peace. He sniffed the air and frowned. He thought maybe it was a chemical factory, maybe a glue factory processing dead animals. He called his officers over.
Find out what that smell is. Report back immediately. A few hours passed. Then a jeep came racing back to headquarters. The officer inside looked like he'd seen a ghost. His hands were shaking. His face was pale white. He could barely get the words out. "General, you need to come see this yourself. You won't believe it unless you see it with your own eyes." Patton never backed down from anything. He climbed into his jeep and drove toward the source of the smell. The place was called Ohrdruf. It was a concentration camp, the first Nazi camp liberated by American forces on the Western Front. And what Patton saw when he walked through those gates changed him forever. This was a man who had seen thousands of dead bodies on battlefields, a man who gave speeches about wading through the blood of enemies, a man who wore ivory pistols and slapped soldiers for showing fear.
But when George Patton walked into Ohrdruf, when he saw what was behind that shed, he turned away and vomited. The toughest general in the American army got physically sick. But the sickness didn't last long. What came next was rage. Pure, cold, calculated rage. Patton looked at the camp. Then he looked at the clean little German town just 2 miles away. The town with flower boxes in the windows. The town where people were going about their daily lives, pretending nothing was happening. And that's when Patton made a decision that would make history. He pointed toward the town with his riding crop. Round them up, every single one of them. The mayor, his wife, the bankers, the doctors, the shopkeepers, everyone. They're gonna see what they pretended not to know. Let me take you back to what Patton actually saw that day, because to understand his rage, you have to understand the horror. Ohrdruf wasn't as large as Auschwitz or Dachau.
It was a subcamp, but size didn't matter. Evil is evil. When the American tanks rolled up to the barbed wire, the SS guards had already run away like cowards. But before they fled, they tried to hide the evidence. They machine-gunned prisoners who were too sick to walk. They piled bodies in sheds. They poured quicklime over corpses to dissolve the flesh faster. They thought they could cover it up. They were wrong. They ran out of time. When American soldiers pushed through the gates, they found walking skeletons, men who weighed 60 or 70 pounds, wearing striped pajamas that hung off their bones. Their eyes were huge in their sunken faces. They looked more like ghosts than humans. These prisoners didn't cheer when they saw the Americans. They were too weak. They just reached out with trembling hands to touch the tanks, to touch the white stars painted on the armor, to make sure the Americans were real, that salvation wasn't just another cruel dream. General Walton Walker, one of Patton's commanders, called him immediately. "Sir, you need to come now. Bring Eisenhower. Bring Bradley. Everyone needs to see this." So they came, the 3 most powerful men in the American military, Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, men who had commanded millions of soldiers, men who thought they had seen everything war could offer. They were wrong. Patton walked through the gates with his usual confidence, helmet polished, riding crop in hand. He looked like a conqueror inspecting his victory, but as he went deeper into the camp, something changed. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, his eyes went dark. They reached the first pile of bodies. 20 corpses, 30, 40, stacked like firewood, naked, starved, shot in the back of the head. Patton stopped walking. He just stared. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then they kept walking. They saw the roll call square, where prisoners stood for hours in freezing cold. They saw the execution posts. A survivor, barely alive, crawled toward Patton. The man tried to kiss Patton's boots. Patton gently helped him stand. There were tears in the general's eyes, real tears. Then they entered the torture shed. This is where it got worse. Inside was a wooden whipping block. The wood was stained almost black with dried blood. There were meat hooks on the walls where prisoners were hung by their necks, left to slowly suffocate. The camp guide, a prisoner who spoke English, explained how SS guards would beat men to death for entertainment, for fun, because they were bored. Eisenhower's face turned white as marble. Bradley couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no words came out. But Patton started shaking, not from fear, from rage. He walked to the back of the shed. His aides saw his shoulders heaving. When he came back, his face was different. This wasn't the face of a warrior anymore. This was the face of a prosecutor, a judge, an executioner. He grabbed a young military police officer by the arm. Did the people in that town know about this? The MP stammered. "They say they didn't, sir. They claim they thought it was just a prison for criminals." Patton laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter, dark, sarcastic. "They didn't know? The smell covers this entire county. You can smell it for miles. They knew. Oh, they knew. They just didn't want to admit it." Patton didn't ask for permission from Eisenhower. He didn't file a request. He just took charge. He called over the provost marshal. He pointed his riding crop at the pretty little town of Ohrdruf sitting peacefully in the distance, 2 miles away from piles of corpses, 2 miles away from torture chambers, the town with clean streets and flowers in the windows. Go into that town right now. Find the mayor, find his wife, find the bankers, the doctors, the shopkeepers, every leading citizen, and bring them here. The officer asked nervously, "Sir, what if they refuse to come?" Patton's hand moved to rest on his ivory pistol. "They won't refuse. Use trucks, use bayonets if necessary, but every single one of them is going to tour this camp today." This wasn't in any military handbook. This was something new, forced witnessing. Patton wanted to destroy their denial. He wanted to take their comfortable lies and shove them into the fire. The next morning, military trucks rolled into Ohrdruf. Soldiers went door to door. They weren't gentle. Within hours, the town's leadership was loaded into trucks and driven toward the camp. These German civilians climbed out wearing their Sunday best, men in pressed suits and ties, women in nice dresses and coats. They looked annoyed more than anything, offended that they were being inconvenienced. Some held handkerchiefs to their noses because of the smell. They complained to each other in German. They still had that arrogance, that superiority. They were Germans, the master race. Why were they being dragged to this unpleasant place? Patton watched them arrive. His face was stone. He gave the order to the MPs. March them through every section of this camp. Don't let them look away. If anyone closes their eyes, you have my permission to force them open. Make them see everything. The tour began. The German civilians were marched toward the first pile of bodies. At first, they were still chatting nervously among themselves. Then they saw the corpses. The talking stopped instantly. The complaining stopped. There was only silence and the sound of flies buzzing. They stared at bodies that looked like skeletons wrapped in thin parchment skin, bodies with sunken faces and empty eyes. One woman fainted immediately, but the MPs didn't stop. Keep moving. They were forced to look at the whipping block, forced to see the torture implements, forced to stare into the open, dead eyes of victims. Patton watched them like a hawk hunting prey. At first, the civilians looked shocked, then horrified. Their faces went pale. Some started crying. But then Patton noticed something else in their expressions. Guilt, recognition. These people had known. Maybe not every detail, but they had known something was wrong. They had chosen not to ask questions, chosen not to look too closely. Patton walked up to the mayor himself. The mayor was trembling head to toe. Tears streamed down his face. Patton looked him directly in the eyes. "You knew, didn't you?" The mayor didn't answer. He just shook his head over and over, but his eyes told the truth. Then Patton turned to his staff officers. "See, they're not the master race. They're just people who sold their souls." The forced tour lasted for 2 full hours. By the end, the German civilians were completely broken. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by horror, by shame,
by something they couldn't name. The smell of death clung to their clothes. The images were burned into their minds forever. They were loaded back onto trucks in complete silence. No one spoke. They drove back to their clean houses with the pretty flower boxes, but nothing would ever be clean again. Patton felt satisfied. Justice had been served. Not legal justice, maybe, but moral justice. He wrote to his wife that night, "I have never felt so angry in my life, but I believe we taught them a lesson they will never forget." But for some, the lesson was too much to bear. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife returned to their home. They walked through their front door, sat down in their living room. Maybe they talked about what they had seen. Maybe they sat in terrible silence. We don't know their last words, but we know their last action. The next morning, American soldiers knocked on the mayor's door with new orders. No answer. They knocked again, louder, still nothing. They kicked the door open. Inside, they found both the mayor and his wife dead. They had slit their own wrists. Beside the bodies was a short note written in German, "We cannot live with this shame." When Patton was informed of the suicide, he showed no pity. He just nodded grimly and said something that sounds cold, but makes sense when you understand what he'd seen. "That's 2 less Nazis we have to feed." It wasn't cruelty. It was the response of a man who had seen the bodies of innocent people tortured to death. He had no tears left for the guilty. But Ohrdruf didn't just change Patton. It transformed Eisenhower completely. Eisenhower was usually calm and diplomatic, but after walking through that camp, he became a crusader. He realized something important. Future generations might deny this ever happened. People would call it propaganda, lies, exaggeration. So Eisenhower ordered a command that would preserve the truth forever. Bring every camera we have. Bring reporters, bring journalists, photograph everything, film everything, document every single detail. He said something that became famous. "Get it all on record now, because the day will come when some bastard will say this never happened." He also ordered thousands of American soldiers in nearby units to tour the camp. He wanted his men to understand exactly why they were fighting, why their friends had died. Before Ohrdruf, many soldiers thought the war was about politics and territory. After Ohrdruf, they knew the truth. This was a war between good and evil. One young soldier wrote in his diary that night, "I will never feel sorry for a German again. Now I know what we're fighting for. We're fighting monsters." Ohrdruf was small compared to other camps, but it was the first liberated by Americans. It was the camp that awoke the world. Because of Patton's rage and his order to march civilians through those gates at gunpoint, the veil of secrecy was destroyed. German people could no longer say they didn't know. Patton made absolutely sure they knew. This event changed how America treated Germany after the war. The friendly occupation plans were thrown out. Denazification began in earnest. Patton is usually remembered for his tanks, his ivory pistols, his speeches about blood and guts. But on that spring day in April 1945, he wasn't acting like a general. He was acting like a human being confronted with absolute evil. And his response wasn't to look away. His response was to grab evil by the throat and force the entire world to stare directly at it. The mayor of Ohrdruf couldn't live with what he saw. But because of Patton, because of Eisenhower, because of those cameras and those photographs, the world will never be able to forget. And you know what? Patton and Eisenhower were right to worry. Today, there are still people who tried to deny these things ever happened. That's exactly why stories like this must be told. If you believe this history needs to be